Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. The problems that led to the clone troopers' replacement after the war and the ultimate purpose for their creation is well known. But what if I were to tell you that the clone troopers were the right soldier, but for the wrong war? The clones were ultimately expensive, genetically weak, and incredibly costly in comparison to the droids they were fighting. But by looking at our own history, we can begin to see what the clone troopers' true purpose was. The motivations, methods of control, and command structure of the clone army all reflect what we see in a modern military force built for occupation. This was basically also the role that the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps had within its own borders. And so today I want to explain to you guys why the clone trooper army was the perfect occupational force by using comparisons between the clone army and the French Foreign Legion. The clones were ultimately expendable, detached from the places they were fighting, and unloved by the populations who they fought for. Though they were heavily humanized in the Clone Wars show, they were only marginally more human than the invading battle droid. These are all significant disadvantages in a war of attrition, where essentially every inch of ground is essential. But in an occupational force, these are ideal qualities. An army, no matter how well trained, cannot be forced to care about a place when they have no personal investment in it. A soldier fighting in a foreign land probably has no connection to that land, but he might be fighting for some kind of cause or nation, but it's also very likely that he won't die for it. On the other hand, give a citizen of that land a gun, and it's remarkable the level of bravery and self-sacrifice that one person will show in the name of protecting their family. There are countless accounts of insurgent groups taking horrendous casualties. Although they oftentimes are barely trained, they can by sheer force of will outlast an occupation. For instance, during the Soviet-Afghan War, the Afghans actually suffered 3 million casualties. The Soviets only suffered 40,000. For Emperor Palpatine clearly failed to learn this lesson about insurgencies that our Earth leaders today are all too familiar with. Massive wars on Earth are usually fought after the mobilization of a civilian populace to defend their homes for tangible gain. A war between nations becomes a national effort that confronts the citizens with the horrors of the enemy and creates direct personal investment. The goal of a leader of this nation is to bring all of its citizens together in combined suffering because of what the enemy is doing. The Soviets during World War II often fought with an insane tenacity, not for the love of the Communist Party, but to protect themselves from Nazis who clearly wanted to also exterminate them. The entire nation was mobilized to protect their people from an enemy as terrifying as any battle droid, and the Soviet Union suffered 25 million deaths as a result. The Separatists with their terrible droids, terrible generals like Grievous, and terrible dictators like Dooku could have been demonized easily by the Republican critical Outer Rim territories to rally military and civilian resistance. This way, the Outer Rim territories loyal to the Republic would not be fighting for apathetic senators located all the way in Coruscant. They would be fighting for their own survival and each other. The method of mass mobilization seen here on Earth could be used against the Separatists by turning planetary defense forces into a united force, as seen under the British Empire in World War I. The British Army, despite its surging to almost 7 million soldiers by 1918, started a war with a little more than a colonial police force of 250,000. The British used propaganda and plans established following the Second Boers War and utilized the strength of each colony for the good of the empire. Canadian troops, despite being deemed undisciplined, quickly became known as hard to kill following the Second Battle of Ypres, which also happens to be the site of the first lethal gas attack in that front of the war. Then you have the Aussie miners who built massive underground mines under German lines, leading to some of the most massive explosions in the pre-atomic age. Forces from all over the empire served in the Royal Navy as well and embraced British naval traditions. The British then used Australians, New Zealanders, and even Indians to fight the Ottomans due to their belief that these individuals were ideally suited for desert warfare. The Gurkha, Sikhs, and African forces who were seen as racially inferior entered combat and left the battlefield as anything but inferior and shattered any perception that they were lesser because of their skin color or ethnicity. The British, despite being caught off guard by the scale of the conflict, was able to quickly mobilize and use their entire empire's manpower very efficiently. The Republic was likewise caught off guard by the Separatist crisis and had little more than just a tiny judicial force and the Jedi at their disposal. Despite the fact the Republic had no standing military and very limited planetary defense forces in the Outer Rim, there were still methods they could have used to halt the Separatist advance until at least their traditional army was more prepared for battle. For perspective, if the Republic could muster just 1% of Coruscant's population to enlist, It would have an army of over 10 billion. Multiply this number by the thousands of worlds in the Republic, and the Republic would hold a clear numerical advantage. The sheer potential size of this volunteer force would eliminate any of the social problems you might see in a mandatory draft. The use of each planet's specialty would be an ideal method for creating a sense of unification amongst the Republic. The greatest hurdle that the Republic military would face would not be casualties, but equipping these soldiers. The minuscule cost of recruiting a soldier that is a citizen compared to a clone would make such equipment costs all but irrelevant. The human-centric Republic would further be forced to take on alien fighters as well, which would dissolve the Republic's human-centric focus, which isn't necessarily a good thing. However, when a nation seeks to keep unruly holdings in line or gain influence in an area where soldiers are maintaining a long-term occupation, a limited war usually occurs. The ideal war against a rebellion or insurgent force is one where the population in core nations notices no changes to their daily lives, while a brutal war is fought overseas. The only cost is the military budget and the occasional dead soldier that is highlighted by the media for their own purposes. When citizens begin dying, more are inclined to protest. If the rebellion can inflict sufficient casualties, the public support for the war will eventually evaporate. But if you can use an army that no one really cares about, like the clone army, then your only limit to what your government can take is how much debt it can accrue by expanding its military. The clones and the French Foreign Legions share a remarkable amount of similarities. The clones arrived without a past and were essentially born to fight, knowing only war. French legionnaires were given a blank slate with a new identity and oftentimes had no other options in life left, especially in the old days when they basically took everyone. Now the screening process is a lot more thorough. The clones, on the other hand, were led and governed usually by a republic or an imperial officer who was a true believer in the cause. Except for the most extraordinary clones, there is a clear divide between the leadership and enlisted men. The officers were able to dispose of their troopers without much hesitation as they had no direct bonds with their force and could do whatever was tactically viable. The Jedi also were really emotionally stunted as far as their relationship with their soldiers. The French Foreign Legion also had a very similar system set up where the officers actually had to be French, so that there was some distance between the enlisted and the officers. The clones, despite being born into a life of combat, were promised a way out of their life of war should they survive. Following the termination of their service, they would be granted full citizenship in the Republic or Empire. But such a long-term goal might not motivate all clones. The defection of clone trooper Slick is played off as a one-off instance, but his reasons show what can happen when troops are confronted with the hypocrisy of the Republic and incompetent commanders. The mass insurrection of clones under Master Ponkrell further demonstrates this problem. But these aren't limited to Star Wars. The earthly examples of the French mutinies of 1917 and the failed Algerian push by the French legionnaires show us what happens when troops are not taken care of. The French mutinies of 1917 threatened to destroy the French's ability to defend themselves against the Germans during World War I. If not for the French media censorship, this might have caused France to surrender. The Algerian push, despite failing, helped end the Fourth French Republic. The possibility that the inhibitor chips within their clone troopers could fail terrified the leaders of the Republic and Empire. And despite Disney's current family-friendly atmosphere, we can find some methods of control that exist beyond their inhibitor chips. The clones were rotated from the front to leisure houses that provided various refreshments, taste of spice, companionship, and partying. These places were notorious for both their rowdy clientele and the prevalence of violence. These distractions managed to keep the clones in check beyond the promise of citizenship, which can only last for so long. The French Foreign Legion also had their own pathway to citizenship through service, or if you got wounded and bled for France, you became a French citizen automatically. There are also other ways to redeem your past and even erase any criminal history. The French also provided state-controlled leisure houses in the 1990s to keep their occupation forces motivated. There's one other more sinister reason why the clone troopers and also the French legionnaires were really successful as occupational force. It was their ability to lethally suppress populations. The stormtroopers suffered numerous defections to the rebellion following massacres commanded by fanatical officers. The stormtroopers were often forced to commit mass killings on their birth planets in the name of the Emperor to the detriment of their morale and unit cohesion. The clones, on the other hand, would be perfect for this job. I mean, they're fiercely indoctrinated, they have inhibitor chips inside their brains, and they're really good at following orders. As long as it isn't killing one of their own, they're pretty much okay with anything. The French Foreign Legion, given their lack of attachment to the populations they were oftentimes tasked with controlling, have operated with levels of barbarity that have often brought international condemnation. During the First Indochina War, the French Legionnaire actually deployed SS members who had fought in World War II for the Nazis. The use of the Clone Wars as the Imperial Fist provides a new use for our favorite partially blind stormtroopers. The stormtroopers should be used as an extension for enforcement for the Imperial Security Bureau. This would draw a very clear line between their actions and the actions of the military force that is occupying an area. The ISB and stormtroopers therefore would be separated from the crimes of the Empire in these unruly territories if they are discovered. The stormtroopers would essentially be the thin line between order and chaos. They would be able to deny any knowledge of the crimes of the clone army. The clones were ultimately a human force of mechanical men. They were the perfect disposable foot soldiers of the Emperor. A brutal army trained from birth to obey their orders without moral constraint or preconceptions of liberty, which the hypocritical Galactic Republic failed to overcome. The Legionnaires likewise were a force designed to keep unruly colonies in line under the boot of the French Empire. So that's why we believe the clone trooper is the perfect occupation soldier. If only Palpatine realized this as well, maybe the Galactic Empire would have lasted a lot longer. A special thanks to our fan, Blair, who actually helped us write and research this entire video. Your military experience really came to play here. Thanks again for your help. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below, guys, if you don't want to miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, thanks for joining us. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.